The screaming did not come all at once. It rose in layers, like something being peeled alive, flesh tearing from bone in slow, wet sounds that the forest learned to recognize. Deep in the Cumberland Mountains, where the trees grow so tightly they blot out the sky and the ground never fully dries, there was a child whose skin could not remember how to stay intact. Every movement stripped him. Every breath widened the damage. Blood soaked into the dirt beneath his cradle, and the dirt accepted it without protest. This was not an accident. This was inheritance made visible. They said the boy was born already breaking apart, that when his mother pulled him from her body, skin stayed behind, that his cry sounded less like a newborn and more like something ancient being disturbed. His bones were wrong, too close to the surface, pushing outward as if trying to escape the body they had been sentenced to inhabit. The women who witnessed it crossed themselves and said nothing. Silence had always been the family's first language. The house where he was born stood far from roads and farther from mercy, a cluster of sagging rooms, stitched together over decades, wood darkened by smoke and age, floors warped by rot. Inside, the air smelled of iron and damp cloth. Outside, the forest leaned in, listening. This was a place where bloodlines did not branch. They folded, where names repeated until they lost meaning, where a child could be both beginning and ending at once. If you're listening to this now, take a moment. Which city are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Hold that thought quietly. It will matter later. Long before the boy's birth, the Cumberland region had been mapped and forgotten, its hollows marked only by hand-drawn lines and misspelled names in county ledgers. Families disappeared into these mountains in the 19th century and learned how to survive without being seen. Churches came and went. Schools never stayed. Records thinned. What remained were surnames etched into grave markers, repeating too often, dates clustering too close together. The family in question settled deep in one of those hollows where fog never fully lifts. Outsiders called it isolation. The family called it preservation. They believed the world beyond the ridgeline corrupted everything it touched, so they kept to themselves, married among themselves, raised children who carried the same eyes, the same jawlines, the same quiet deformities passed down like heirlooms. By the time the boy was born, the land already knew what was coming. The animals avoided the house. Dogs refused to enter certain rooms. At night, when the child's skin split open beneath its wrappings and his voice rose again, the sound did not travel far. The trees absorbed it, the mountains closed in, and the family stayed exactly where they were, convinced this suffering had been chosen for them long before the child ever drew breath. The boy would live only a few years, but what he revealed would take generations to surface. The hollow where the family lived did not appear on most maps. Even locals spoke of it vaguely, as if precision might invite something back. It lay pressed between two ridgelines where the sun arrived late and left early, where damp leaves never fully dried and footprints softened into nothing within hours. The nearest town existed more as an idea than a destination, a scattering of buildings along a road that had once promised connection and quietly failed. Old county records from the 1800s mention the area only in passing. Land grants written in cramped ink, census entries with ages that did not quite align, children listed, then erased, surnames repeating across households that should not have been related. When surveyors passed through in the early 20th century, they noted the silence. No livestock calls, no church bells, just smoke rising in thin, disciplined columns from trees that had learned to hide it. The family arrived there generations earlier, carrying with them a belief that separation was salvation. The outside world was spoken of as if it were a sickness that spread through contact. Outsiders brought ideas. Ideas brought decay, so the family turned inward. Marriages were arranged quietly. Births were handled without witnesses who could remember them later. Deaths were buried on the slope behind the house, marked with stones that bore only initials, sometimes not even that. By the time the boy was born, the household had collapsed into itself in ways that were visible even to those who refused to see. Adults moved with stiff, uneven gaits, hands bent where they should not bend, eyes clouded early, speech slowed, simplified, reduced to what was necessary. Children learned quickly not to ask questions that pointed outward. The boy was kept in the innermost room where the air was warmest, and the light dimmest. They wrapped him in layers of soft cloth, but even that was too much. His skin tore beneath the pressure, opening into raw, shining patches that never closed. The women cleaned him with boiled water and whispered prayers that blended scripture with older words no one could trace anymore. He did not cry the way other children cried. His voice came in broken bursts, sharp and panicked, then fell into exhausted silence. He could not be held. Comfort itself caused harm. So he lay there, staring upward, with eyes that seemed too aware of pain for someone so young. Sometimes his fingers twitched as if remembering shapes they had never touched. The family told themselves stories, that the boy was marked, that his suffering meant something, that endurance was proof of worth. When his skin sloughed away and infection followed, they said it was a test. When his body began to stiffen in places and melt in others, they said it was destiny unfolding as it should. At night, when the forest pressed close and the boy's breathing grew shallow and wet, even the most devoted among them felt something shift, a quiet understanding that this was not punishment from outside forces, but consequence rising from within. Still, no one left, no one sent for help. The Hollow had kept their secrets for generations. They trusted it to keep this one too. As the seasons turned, the boy's body failed to follow them. Spring brought no renewal. Summer heat only softened his skin further, made it slip beneath the cloths meant to protect it. Flies learned the smell of him early and had to be driven away constantly, their presence an unspoken admission that decay had already begun. Women burned herbs and resin to keep the insects back, filling the room with a bitter smoke that stung the eyes and settled into the walls. He did not grow the way children were supposed to. His limbs lengthened unevenly, joints swelling and stiffening at the same time. Where skin healed, it healed wrong, pulling tight, fusing fingers together, limiting movement. His mouth blistered when he tried to feed, so nourishment became a careful ritual of small amounts, slow enough not to tear him from the inside. Hunger and pain learned to coexist in him until they were indistinguishable. There were moments, though, that unsettled even those accustomed to deformity. Times when the boy would lie perfectly still, eyes tracking movement in the room with an intensity that felt older than him. He watched people as if studying patterns. Sometimes he smiled at nothing visible. Sometimes he stared into corners long after the light had shifted away. The older children were warned not to linger near his room, not because he was dangerous, but because they were. Their careless movements, their weight on the floorboards, their breath too close to his skin could open him again. Still, they listened. They learned the rhythm of his suffering by sound, the sharp intake of breath before a scream, the wet silence that followed, the low murmurs of adults trying to convince themselves this was necessary. Outside the house, the Hollow remained watchful. Deer paths curved away from the structure, birds avoided the eaves. On some nights, dogs from distant farms howled in a way that made the adults pause, hands still, listening. They told themselves animals sensed storms, nothing more. The boy began to draw once his hands could hold charcoal. Crude shapes at first, lines that crossed back over themselves again and again, circles folded inward, figures with too many joints, bodies without skin. He scratched these images onto scraps of wood and old paper, pressing hard enough that the motion reopened his fingers. Blood stained the drawings, darkening them, becoming part of the image. No one took the drawings away. They were kept in a box beneath his bed, added to quietly. The family believed expression was safer than suppression, better to let whatever was inside him find its way out than to trap it there. By the time he was old enough to recognize names, he responded only to a few, mostly those that were repeated elsewhere in the house, names shared by uncles, cousins, grandparents. When spoken, his eyes flickered with recognition that felt less like learning and more like remembering. The Hollow had seen sick children before. It had buried them without ceremony, but this one lingered, and as he did, the sense grew among the adults that his presence was not simply the result of their choices, but a mirror held up to them, one they could no longer look away from without seeing themselves reflected in his wounds. The boy's presence began to warp the household in ways that were impossible to ignore. Rooms grew colder near his crib, drafts moving in patterns that no one could trace. Wood creaked under weight that was not there, and shadows stretched longer, folding unnaturally over walls and corners. At night, the forest seemed to press closer, branches scraping windows in rhythms that matched his cries. The adults whispered that it was the marking of the bloodline. Speaking, a warning or a test. But there were moments, brief and sharp, when even they could feel the raw, unmediated horror, the body itself revolting against its own existence. The older children began to understand, on the edge of comprehension, that the boy was not like them. He was a map of the family's past, a record of each misstep repeated over decades. They watched the skin split on his arms and legs, saw fingers begin to fuse under scar tissue, and recognized in those grotesque patterns the echoes of grandparents and cousins. This knowledge came not through words, but through a kind of silent, oppressive inevitability. The family had always known suffering. He carried it fully, concentrated, like some living calculation of their failures. At times, visitors came. Rare, wary neighbors who had not forgotten that the hollow existed. They brought bread, milk, or whispers of news from beyond the mountains. The boy never spoke to them, but he watched. His eyes, dark and luminous in the dim interior, tracked movements with an intelligence that unsettled those brave enough to step inside. Some of the neighbors claimed later that it was like being seen by something that was older than life itself. They left quickly, often muttering prayers under breath, refusing ever to return. In the silence of the nights, the boys' cries became less erratic and more like a language all their own. No adult could translate it fully, though they listened as though the tone alone carried meaning. His existence demanded ritual, constant adjustments of bandages, careful rotations to prevent further skin loss, nightly applications of poultices that stung and smelled of iron. 3 adults, were often required to move him safely, 1 to hold, 1 to adjust the cloths, 1 to tend to the wounds as the boy screamed until his voice broke. The house carried the echoes for hours afterward, the vibrations lingering in the warped wood, the air saturated with salt and iron and the residue of despair. The family itself began to fracture under the strain. Marcus, the patriarch, insisted the suffering was proof of spiritual strength, a crucible that would refine them if they endured. Sarah, the mother, oscillated between prayer and exhaustion, her hands bruised from care, her voice hoarse from repeated invocations that never seemed to be heard. Eleanor, the grandmother, whose hands had delivered 12 children before, now trembled with the knowledge that she had brought another into the world already condemned. It was in these long, unbearable nights that the child began to show small, incomprehensible signs of awareness. He would follow sounds with his eyes that were beyond normal sight. He would clutch at shapes invisible, as if grasping something only he could perceive. His drawings, once simple, now depicted twisted forms, bodies contorted, figures trapped within themselves, spirals folding over and back into the center. The adults saw these and whispered that the boy understood more than his age would allow, that perhaps he carried memories not of this world, of the family, of the mountains themselves. And in this hollow, surrounded by the fog and the weight of generations, the truth that had been obscured for decades began to reveal itself. The boy's very existence was a record, and records once made cannot be erased. It was not long before the full weight of the family's choices became undeniable. The boy, barely able to lift his own limbs, became the living measure of generations folded inward, of bloodlines spiraling back upon themselves until the body itself could no longer endure. Marcus and Sarah had long hidden the details from the outside, but no amount of secrecy could obscure the physical reality. Their child was the culmination of decades of deliberate inbreeding, a body preordained to fail. By his 2nd year, more than 1/3 of his skin had chronic lesions, raw and glistening patches that never healed and spread like wildfire across fragile tissue. Fingers and toes fused unpredictably, joints twisted at angles that should have been impossible, and the smallest touch could tear what little skin remained. Every step of care was an exercise in ritualized violence, swaddling, peeling cloth, applying herbal pastes, avoiding pressure on the very surfaces of life itself. The air in the house carried the bitter scent of iron and rot, thick with the sound of screams muffled by distance and walls that had absorbed centuries of silence. The family's other children watched in quiet horror, learning early the rules of proximity. To approach incorrectly, to breathe too heavily, could reopen the wounds. They learned to tiptoe, to measure sound, to become shadows themselves. Some whispered to him, telling him stories of the foresty animals, the hidden streams, but the boy rarely responded. His mind seemed wrapped in a fog, delayed and distorted, as if cognition itself had been slowed by the collapse of his own body. But the boy's limitations were accompanied by an unsettling awareness. He would sometimes stare into sea, corners where no one stood, follow invisible lines along the floor, or reach for shapes that existed only to him. His drawings evolved in tandem with this perception, depicting bodies folded inward, faces splitting in unnatural ways, spirals within spirals. Occasionally, the adults would glance at them and feel a creeping terror. The images were not random, they mirrored the very architecture of their family tree, the repeated marriages, the loops and knots of shared blood. The parents insisted that the child's suffering was sacred, a test of endurance, proof that the family's purity required trial. But Eleanor, the grandmother, who had delivered dozens of children, saw it differently. She knew that the boy's agony was neither spiritual nor redemptive. She had witnessed the physical decline of prior generations, but this, the boy, was the culmination. She whispered to herself in the dark, a mix of prayer and confession, and began to question the doctrine that had guided them for so long. The neighbors, few who dared approach, began to murmur rumors of the child. They spoke in hushed tones at the general store, of grey skin, of sores that never healed, of cries that carried farther than they should. Some feared to enter the forest, certain that the boy carried something unnatural, a curse born from blood repeated too many times. Others felt pity, but even that was tempered by fear, an instinct to avoid what the forest had claimed. And as the boy's body continued its relentless decline, the hollow itself seemed to react. Drafts became sharper, shadows deeper, trees pressing closer to the structures as though to contain the suffering within. The forest was witness, and the bee, Oi in his small, twisted body, became both record and altar, the evidence of generations of choices that could not be undone. It was during one of these long, cold nights that a terrible truth began to reveal itself in the family records, hidden in the attic, a truth that would fracture the household forever. The parents themselves were not merely distant relatives. Their lineage folded inward again and again, connecting them in ways that made the boy's suffering inevitable. Nathan, the boy's older brother, began to sense it before anyone else dared name it. He had grown up in the same twisted halls, sharing meals and chores with cousins and siblings, each child marked subtly by the same genetic spiral. His own body carried minor echoes, asthma, slight curvature of the spine, learning delays that made reading a slow, painful task. But Daniel, his brother, was different. Daniel's body was a ledger, each saw, each fused joint, a line item of the family's deliberate cruelty and devotion to isolation. Nathan could feel it in the way the air shifted when he entered the small room, how the walls seemed to lean toward him, listening. He began to watch. At night, after the adults had gone to their separate corners, Nathan would sit outside the crib, careful not to touch his brother, letting his eyes follow the subtle movements, a twitch of the fingers, a shifting of the legs, the faint rising of chest with each agonizing breath. He whispered stories into the darkness, low and measured, speaking of the forest beyond the ridge, of deer grazing in the moonlight, of the river that cut through the hollow, always careful not to disrupt the fragile skin. Daniel rarely responded. Sometimes his eyes would flicker, a fleeting sign that he understood something beyond comprehension. Other times he remained still, as if the body itself were too preoccupied with survival to allow thought. The adults noticed the interaction, but did not intervene. Marcus believed the boy's suffering was holy, a crucible that would strengthen the family blood. Sarah prayed in long murmurs, hands pressed together until her knuckles whitened, muttering for endurance, for fortitude, for some hidden purpose that seemed to justify all the pain. Eleanor watched silently, her gaze haunted. She had delivered 12 children, seen deformity, illness, death, but this This was different. She had buried too many, had washed bodies too young for the world, and now the final ledger of their choices lay before her in Daniel's body. In the attic of the oldest cabin, Nathan began to find fragments of truth, trunks of yellowed paper, brittle with age, letters folded carefully, diaries with small scrawled entries about births and deaths, illnesses and unions that now made him shiver. He read descriptions of children with missing limbs, deformed spines, fused fingers, and eyes that never fully opened. And then the genealogies, loops and folds in the family tree so tight they resembled spirals, cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces. Every generation recorded meticulously, every consequence noted but never acted upon. The revelation was immediate and horrifying. Daniel's suffering was not a freak accident. It was the inevitable endpoint of decades of intentional choices. Each adult, each elder in the house had known, and yet the pattern continued, justified by superstition, by twist, faith, by a conviction that purity demanded trial. The child was both punishment and proof, and the adults had accepted that as necessity. Nathan understood then that the burden of action was his alone. The adults would not seek help. They could not. Their worldview could not accommodate outside intervention. But he could. And in that moment, amidst the darkness, the chill of the hollow, and the distant sounds of the forest pressing near, he resolved to do what the family could not. He would carry the secret outside, beyond the ridges, beyond the forest, beyond the weight of generations. The first journey beyond the hollow was a trial in itself. Nathan walked the treacherous path alone, boots sinking into mud, snow and ice, making each step uncertain. The forest loomed on either side, pines like sentinels, their branches scraping together as if whispering warnings. He carried only a satchel with the few documents he had taken from the attic, letters, genealogical charts, brittle papers that threatened to crumble with every jostle. Each step away from the compound was a step into a world that seemed impossibly distant, a reality he had never known existed beyond the fog, the isolation, the constant hum of decay. When he reached the town of Jellicoe, he found it bustling with the ordinary movements of ordinary people, shoes clacking on sidewalks, doors opening, voices calling out across streets. It was alien. Nathan felt exposed, his breath catching, as if the town itself might devour him for bringing its quiet disruption into the hollow. But he remembered Daniel's small, twisted body, the pain etched into every line of his skin, the cries that had echoed endlessly in the house. He could not turn back. Not now. At the sheriff's office he spoke. Words stumbled at first, trembling between disbelief and certainty, but the story poured out, the isolation, the deliberate unions, the children who had suffered and died, the rituals of care that were torture in disguise. The officials were cautious, polite, skeptical. A boy from a hidden hollow, speaking of sores and fused fingers, of a child that seemed almost not of this world. How could they believe him? Yet Nathan persisted, reciting names, dates, locations, the details that would have been impossible to fabricate. It took weeks for anyone to act. Social workers and medical professionals had to plan, to prepare for what they would find, because what Nathan described sounded more like legend than truth. But when they arrived, following the narrow path through the forest, the compound revealed itself in full. Dilapidated cabins pressed together, roofs sagging, walls bowed under the weight of years of neglect. Smoke rose from the chimneys, pale and hesitant, as though the house itself feared intrusion. Inside, the full extent of the devastation was apparent. 17 people lived there, 14 visibly affected by deformities, twisted limbs, fused digits, impaired vision, mobility issues. Children huddled silently, their bodies scarred, their expressions wary, eyes tracking every movement. The adults resisted, shouted, barricaded doors. Marcus leveled a rifle, though he never fired, his presence rigid with fury and fear. But Eleanor, the grandmother, finally spoke the words that broke the spell. "Take the young ones. They deserve better than what we've given them." The removal of 6 childer from the compound caused a quiet shockwave through the county. Newspapers briefly noted the intervention, though identities remained protected. Medical examinations revealed what Nathan had known instinctively: the bloodline had reached its genetic limit. Every surviving child carried multiple disorders. The spiral of inbreeding, generation after generation, had concentrated defects beyond what any outsider could have predicted. The house in the hollow, once a cradle of twisted tradition, became empty. Nature began reclaiming it immediately, vines pushing through floors, rotting timbers collapsing. Nathan himself entered foster care, haunted by memories he would carry for decades. Daniel was gone, but the echo of his screams, the smell of his deteriorating flesh, the sight of his twisted limbs, these remained etched in Nathan's mind, an unshakable ledger of a family consumed by its own isolation. The boy had died, but his death became the catalyst for intervention, research, and a slow, painful understanding of what happens when tradition overrides the right of a child to exist unharmed. In the years that followed, the hollow was erased from memory as much as it was from the landscape. The cabins rotted, the forest crept over the clearings, and the small cemetery where Daniel and 18 others were buried became almost invisible among wild grasses and saplings. The markers, simple wooden posts, weathered and splintered, leaned at impossible angles, names faded into nothing. Nature, patient and relentless, reclaimed the place, leaving only shadows of suffering behind. Nathan spent decades carrying the weight of that hollow. He changed his surname, moved to distant Coup. NTIS, worked in outreach, always with the memory of Daniel's body as both compass and compass point. He trained social workers, spoke to medical professionals, lectured quietly at conferences, always using the story of his brother to illuminate the consequences of insular isolation. He described the rituals of care, the 3 adults required to change a boy who should have been able to lie in a crib, the smell of iron and decay, the cry that never ceased. And he repeated, endlessly, that children born into closed bloodlines are not simply unlucky. They are victims of a pattern, a deliberate human choice repeated through generations. Medical researchers pored over the family's records after Nathan allowed access. Geneticists marveled and shuddered at the clarity of the data: 163 years of tightly wound consanguinity, 87 documented births, 63 deaths before the age of 20. The genealogy spiraled back on itself in ways that made diagrams resemble something closer to a knot than a tree. Each generation multiplied the risks. Each marriage within the family compounded the genetic load. Daniel was not an anomaly. He was the inevitable outcome of decisions made with eyes wide open. Yet the story extended beyond the hollow. The surviving children removed from the compound faced difficult lives. Some thrived in supportive environments, gaining access to medical care and education, but all bore the imprint of their lineage: chronic pain, developmental delays, the psychological weight of isolation. For Nathan, the burden was both guilt and responsibility. He could not save his brother, but he could speak the truth of what had been done, ensure it was remembered, ensure that our children might not endure the same fate. In the quietest moments, Nathan spoke to the memory of Daniel. He recalled the boy's grey skin, the twisted limbs, the fused fingers, the endless cries that filled the hollow with despair. And he remembered what Eleanor had said before the children were removed: they deserve better than what we've given them. Those words became a mantra, a warning, a call that he carried into every classroom, every conference, every conversation with a policymaker or social worker. The Cumberland forests still stand, unchanged by the tragedy, their pines stretching toward the sky, streams flowing over moss-covered rocks, wildlife thriving in silent, indifferent continuity. Beneath that beauty, the memory of the Thornnehill family lingers, of a bloodline turned inward, of choices repeated for centuries, of a boy born already in collapse. Daniel's body, brief as his life was, became both record and cautionary tale, a testament to the consequences of isolation, tradition, and human obstinacy. The hollow is silent now, but if one listens closely, the echoes remain. The cries, the whispers, the slow decay of flesh and spirit, they are recorded in memory, in history, in DNA. And through Nathan's efforts they endure as warnings. Children deserve better. always better than the traditions, always better than the silence, always better than the choices of adults who value ideology over life. Daniel Thornnehill lived 3 years, 3 months and 14 days, but the lesson of his life is eternal. And the Cumberland forests, beautiful and indifferent, keep their secret still, waiting for those who are willing to listen. The story ends here.